San Francisco is a long way from Gaza City or Aadvinka, but as warring sides in the Middle East and Ukraine dig in for the long haul, could an Asia-Pacific summit offer the venue where superpowers dial down the rhetoric of confrontation? At first glance, you would not think so. The first face-to-face meeting scheduled in more than a year between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping comes as the U.S. enters an election cycle where China bashing is popular across political divides and where nationalism is integral to China's president's tightening of his own grip on power. But with foreign investors frightened off by Beijing's hardline bend and the U.S. wary of standoffs in Taiwan and the Pacific that jeopardize the ties that binds, both sides have an interest to tone it down. Fact is, since the late 90s, China has provided the goods that the United States sells, both at home and around the world. We'll ask about Wednesday's Biden-Xi meeting on the sidelines of the APEC summit. And more broadly, in a post-COVID world where fear and confrontation are rife, how does this rivalry evolve? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking about when Biden meets Xi. And joining us from Washington, Zongyang Liu, Fellow for International Political Economy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Economist Jean-Paul Cheng is in our midst. How are you?
And thank you.
André Lezecoq-Petry, president of the Joint European Disruptive Initiative, who advocates for more digital innovation in Europe, right? Correct?
More digital, more technology. Hello, François.
Thanks for being with us. And from Rennes in sunny Brittany, Philippe Lecor, senior fellow at the Asia Society. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Good to be here.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter. The hashtag is F24Debate. Before meeting Xi Jinping, Joe Biden had hoped to land in San Francisco with something that allies at the summit could sign. But that Indo-Pacific economic framework is not oven-ready. Turns out several key lawmakers back in Washington from Biden's own party want stronger guarantees on labor rights, like Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown, who faces a tough re-election challenge in a Rust Belt state where industry jobs have fled in the past due to outsourcing. He chairs the upper chamber's powerful banking committee. More from Eliza Herbert.
It's called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and it is designed to strengthen alliances and economic ties with 13 partners around the Pacific region, as well as counter China's rapid growth and influence. However, plans to announce its progress at the APEC summit fell short this week, with the problem, trade.
In a number of areas that I think are critically important to the United States, like supply chains and the environment, sustainable finance, we've made a huge amount of progress, and we've made progress on trade too, but it appears not to be complete.
The trade pillar, which covers issues such as regulatory practices, importing and exporting procedures, and agriculture, has faced hurdles within the US government. Several Democratic lawmakers have threatened to oppose the deal and said that they would only support it if it included enforceable labour standards and environmental protection. The framework would be the US's most significant economic engagement with the Asia-Pacific region since former President Donald Trump pulled the states out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2017, and would see 3 of the world's 5 largest economies, the US, Japan and India, join countries like Australia and South Korea.
This would be a monumental achievement for IPEF members, addressing issues from climate change to supply chain security. And since IPEF members collectively account for 40% of global GDP, it would be significant for the global economy as well.
The framework is set to be a talking point at the APEC summit this week, which is taking place for the first time in the US since 2011, amidst global disarray with the war in Gaza and Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Zongyang Liu, this senator from Ohio raising objections, not the only one, but one of the ones. It's kind of a reminder of the long arc of U.S.-China relations. When China entered the World Trade Organization, there was a lot of money made between both the U.S. and China. But at the same time, there was a story of globalization with jobs outsourced to the other side of the world, and that has become a huge domestic issue in the United States.
Absolutely. But I would wanted to point out that actually, the demographic or labor premium in the Chinese market has diminished over the years. Most recently, literally last year, China experienced the first ever negative population growth. And then on the other hand, reading in the news, China or the Chinese labor market actually is not necessarily as vibrant as before. Although the Chinese government paused updating the youth unemployment, but the last time they updated it, youth unemployment was as high as above 21%, which is actually almost 2 times the average of OECD. So, in terms of labor advantage, China's comparative advantage in young, educated, skilled labor and at a cheaper price compared to the United States, that advantage has already diminished.
But in this case, this is a trade pact. You could almost call it what, an anti-trade pact, anti-China trade pact, a trade pact among other APEC allies, where the number of workers to hand is plentiful.
Absolutely, you are right, and I like the way you described it. Yes, it is a trade pact, but depending upon the angle you take it, it could be viewed as anti-trade. But personally, I do not necessarily think this is anti-trade in the sense that it actually is President Biden's vision for the Asia-Pacific area, and more specifically, it comes at a time when TPP did not succeed during the Trump administration, and then at the same time, China led the RCEP as well as the other types of regional cooperation mechanism actually moved forward. So from that perspective, to maintain U.S. leadership in the region, IPEF is important.
Does the U.S. show leadership when we see André Lozier-Petri, how, again, a couple of key lawmakers in Washington can scuttle this agreement that Joe Biden was hoping to bring to show to all of his allies?
Well, that's probably the power and sometimes the weakness of democracies. We see that in the US is actually much more split. I mean, we have the camp that advocates for discussion with China, engagement with China. That's Antony Blinken, Janet Yellen, that you showed just before. And then there is this whole I would say traditional Rust Belt central states that are much more focused on what initially was the last election discussion during the U.S. campaign, which was, bringing back jobs to America. And I think this rift will only get stronger in the coming months before the election. The other thing I want to say is it's also a discussion among different solutions for the world. Let's not forget a couple of weeks ago, there was this very apparently successful BRICS meeting where basically China brought together a lot of countries from the so-called global south. And I think the US is trying to show that it can itself broker some kind of an agreement that goes beyond trade. And let's not forget also that Europe is currently having huge difficulty to broker even one deal with partner countries in the Pacific, like Australia or others. So we see every big region in the world is currently trying to expand its influence at the moment where deglobalization is at full swing.
Yeah, Philippe Lecor, it's interesting. You have, as Andre was mentioning, there's been this, at the G20, India talked up this partnership with Europe to try to have a rival to the Belt and Road Initiative of China. Here you have Joe Biden trying to put together this trade pact with Indo-Pacific nations, which is coming up against resistance in Washington. The answers to China, if you try to do it on a multilateral basis, it's difficult.
Well, you're right. I mean, there's nothing new about trying to find alternatives to the Chinese ideas, such as the Belt and Road Initiative. But the Belt and Road Initiative is far from being a success. When you look at the achievements, they are quite limited, really. And when it comes to Europe in particular, which was originally the final destination to the Belt and Road. Very few leaders attended the last forum, and very few achievements, really. I mean, there are achievements in other parts of the world, but not in Europe. As far as the G20 versus the BRICS is concerned, it's true that the BRICS was extended from 5 to 11 members. I don't know what name will come out of this, and I don't know what concrete realizations will come out of this. But it's also true that the G20, which is considered by many as the main forum for discussions between West and East and between South and North, is now becoming handicapped by the absence of China, at least at the head of state level, which was the case in India. Now, there was no coincidence about the fact, Mr. Xi chose not to attend the summit in Delhi while he attended the one in Johannesburg to show. I mean, this is really part of the rhetoric that we've been hearing. East rises, West falls, and all of this. Dongsheng, Xizang, this kind of dialectic that China has gotten.
And yet he's coming to San Francisco. Why?
Right. Well, he's coming because, honestly, the Americans have been pushing very hard, obviously. We are a year from the election, exactly a year, in the US. There's a Taiwanese election coming up in January. And this is the time, the only possibility really to restart a dialogue. Otherwise, there's a war going on in Ukraine. There's another war in the Middle East, and then the electoral situation in the US will make it very difficult to have a quiet and reasonable dialogue between China and the United States. So I think both sides agree that this is time to have a discussion before we enter a very dangerous situation in the Indo-Pacific, as it threatens frequently.
Yeah, it's going to be a rocky year ahead. Before leaving Washington, Joe Biden serving up some conciliatory noises ahead of his Wednesday sit-down with the Chinese president.
How would you define success with your meeting with President Xi?
To get back on a normal course of corresponding, being able to pick up the phone and talk to one another if there's a crisis, being able to make sure our military still have contact with one another. We can't take, as I told you, we're not trying to decouple from China. But what we're trying to do is change the relationship for the better.
Jean-Paul Chang, we're not trying to decouple from China. Are they trying to decouple from China?
This has been repeated not only by Mr. Biden.
It's repeated so often that I asked the question.
Yeah, but that's it's just I believe the Americans just want to show they have the will to normalize the relations with China for the present period, because the risk was to see the relations completely broken otherwise. And as the Chinese put this problem of decoupling on the table all the time, so it's kind of a message of reassuring the Chinese that don't worry, we don't want to start a complete Cold War with you, but it's maybe a little bit opportunistic.
And they are looking for other options. We saw India's commerce minister was in California Monday, visited a Tesla factory. Elon Musk wants to open a factory there. We've talked about Foxconn, the maker of what goes into a lot of the Apple iPhones, moving to India. Of course, that hasn't happened yet.
I believe it's very difficult to really disrupt the supply chain between China and the United States, in view of the complexity of the links between all kind of sectors between China and the United States. So
you mean there's no other option?
No serious option. Okay, it takes time. If people are betting on India, they still need maybe 10 years to have the same kind of economic ecosystem, logistic, supply chain locally built. To replace China, it's not completely realistic, and in view of the present size of the Indian economy compared to the Chinese, in terms of maturity of the economic and the financial system in India and in China. So there's no very serious solution of excluding China from all this, So it's, and also you have the problem of the Americans, they are aware also of some opportunities still existing in China for American, let's say, farmers. We just had a big exhibition of importation in China, and we had this biggest American representation ever of all the American farmers, and so. And even the big high-tech companies are trying to avoid the new rules of sanctions and trying to find innovative solutions to sell to China.
Of course, China has its own issues. For the first time since such records began in 1978, official statistics point to more foreign investors pulling out than coming in. A host of reasons, including one that Jean-Paul just alluded to. Since August, Washington has stricter rules on trading sensitive technologies with China. But there's also a general distrust of Beijing's increased authoritarian bend. This is Nikkei, the Japanese news agency, reporting that the revised Chinese counter-espionage law, which took effect in July and broadens the scope of what is deemed spying, has also made companies nervous, Andrei Lizakuk.
Yeah, very nervous. And what is interesting is that actually Xi and Biden apparently will not have dinner together. Xi Jinping will go to a dinner apparently hosted by the Business Roundtable of American business leaders who are increasingly concerned about their existing and future investments in the country on the Wednesday, on the evening after the meeting. So that's very interesting. This is probably also one of the reasons Xi
And what will his message be?
Well, that is interesting to be seen because the numbers show that finally, there's always a latency. I mean, the Chinese market is so important, but now the growth is going down. Zhang just mentioned about it. And secondly, the banging on foreign companies have been, constant since a couple of years. Interestingly, some companies are coming back. You probably heard that Meta has now made a joint venture in a different way to go back to China. So the size of the market is still so huge. And talking about India, let's not also forget what happened in the last 18 months. India has not played the card of, for example, the West, if I can call it like that, on Ukraine. It played its own card. So you cannot just say, we will have now an ally who will follow you. India is playing its card. It's not playing the card of the West, neither of China. It's playing in it. So it's a huge economy, but it's still 3.5 times smaller than the Chinese one.
So Song Yandu, when Joe Biden sits down with Xi Jinping, who's got the stronger hand at this point? Or maybe I should ask, who's got the weaker hand at this point?
If I can talk about in terms of a physical metaphor, it really depends upon who probably weighs more, right? But from a geopolitical or economic perspective, I would say that perhaps this time China's economic momentum as well as growth trajectory for the first time is not necessarily as looking good as that of the United States. Remember last year, and in particular this time compared with a year ago when President Biden and Xi Jinping met in Bali, at that time, the Chinese economy was the only major economy that was growing positively, whereas the rest of the world was still under COVID restrictions, one way or another, in terms of different degrees. And on top of that, at that time, Wall Street was predicting the U.S. economy entering into a recession, whereas people were anticipating the Chinese economy, once China ended the zero COVID restriction, the Chinese economy would snap back. But the economic situation completely flipped. The U.S. economy not only defied the forecasted recession, but booked about 4.9% growth as of the third quarter. In contrast, the Chinese economy is now sort of like borderline flirting with deflation. So from that perspective, President Xi Jinping probably is facing a lot of pressure in terms of stabilizing U.S.-China relations so that he can get the much-needed confidence boost from international investors into the Chinese economy.
To really emphasize on the point that was just made, I mean, the economic growth engine of the world today is the U.S. It's definitely not Europe, 20% of GDP, 4% of growth only coming from here. But I want to emphasize, I think for the US, it's the military part. I think they're very worried that with the Taiwan elections, China is a little bit a wild card, adding a lot of uncertainty to what's happening in Ukraine and in the Middle East. And so they're very worried. And I think, let's not forget, Biden, despite, or maybe because of its age, is one of the most shrewdest politician in the US. And he knows what happened in the 60s when there was no direct communication between the Soviets and the US, and with the almost all-out war that happened in '62. And this is exactly this kind of, probably if there is an achievement of having military-to-military discussion and lines that are cut since a year now, that would be already kind of a reassurance that there will be no other front by accident in the East.
Okay, André mentioning the age of the U.S. president indirectly there. He's 80 years old. And we see that, yeah, there's a rivalry between China and the U.S. There's also a mutual fascination, particularly as Joe Biden embarks on a re-election campaign. People on the street in Beijing think so.
Normally in China, most of us older people have retired by now. But Biden is still fighting for the American people. He must have endurance, as well as support from the American people. He must have something that the American people hope for. Just like us Chinese supporting Xi Jinping, we all have hopes, right? This is what we entrust in them, the hopes of the common people.
So, Jean-Paul Chang, just tell us, is that man saying nice things because he's being polite for the cameras? Or is there a thing where the Chinese appreciate an elder statesman?
Let's say if you compare the picture of Mr. Biden and those of Mr. Xi Jinping, what he said actually in the street is a normal reaction. I mean, not only from the Chinese, a lot of people could say the same thing. The things in China, but the other aspect, you're right, and people are not saying everything in Beijing, and there also a kind of malaise, somehow felt at the level of. I mean, it's more actually inside the leadership than in the street. It means that the continuation of all this campaign. Anti-corruption campaign with all this sacking of high officials, etc., is introducing a kind of, I would not say a total paralysis, but a kind of apathy. People are careful about the initiative, so it could...
Careful about what they do, careful about what they say. I want to talk more about that in a moment.
A problem of incentive or motivation, right. Okay? In the absence of motivation and incentive, the danger for the Chinese leadership is to see the party organization
kind of paralysis,
show a kind of apathy, a kind of a lack of initiative in the definition of new policy or applying the new policy. That's a problem. But
I want to get back to that point in a minute.
Yeah, okay.
There's about what's been going on domestically, because so much is going on domestically inside of China. But just a little bit more on this dynamic between the United States and China. We've talked so much about the rivalry 2 weeks ago, though, and André was mentioning it, trying to reopen those lines of communication. The Pentagon sending its top official on China to a security forum in the capital, while China's vice president met with 2 U.S. veterans who flew with the Flying Tigers, the revered joint American-Chinese squadron that fought against the Japanese in World War II. One of them, Harry Moyer, celebrated his 103rd birthday in Beijing.
It's one of the last of the Flying Tigers. Myself out to be anything that can help that situation. That is my only hope. That is my primary purpose of being here at this age, is to come to China and spread the story of and the message of the Flying Tigers about America and China. That we have to get together. Now it's up to the new generations to do so.
And spread that message he has, Philippe Lecor, because that's gotten a lot of play in Chinese media.
Well, it reminds me of the visit by Henry Kissinger just a few months ago, who is 100 years old and who was brought to Beijing by the Chinese leadership around the same time as a state, a member of the U.S. cabinet. I think she was the Secretary of Commerce, and Anthony Blinken had been there just previously. So it looks like China likes parallel diplomacy. China likes to set the rules and try to set the discourse. And by having people like this, by inventing a narrative or recreating a narrative that is favorable, just to set the scene in a favorable way. That's what they're trying to do in the run-up to San Francisco. But to be honest, 30 years ago, I was at an APEC meeting in Seattle with President Jiang Zemin. And Jiang Zemin was a very popular man in the US, and he visited the Boeing factory and all of this. And now today we are talking about the two heads of state that may not be having dinner together. So, the gap is really huge, and it's going to be difficult to restore any kind of normality after these few years, the Trump years first, but also the Biden years, where the trade sanctions have not been canceled by the Biden administration, and where, despite all the attempts by the US, China has not really made any efforts to improve the situation. So this is a sort of soft way to improve China's image in US eyes, and perhaps to show to the Chinese people, because at the end of the day, that's what China is good at. It's communicating to its own people that it's trying to improve the relationships with the other superpower, despite at the same time gathering countries and also criticizing the West and the US on many fronts, including in Ukraine and including in the Middle East, and certainly the discourse, the Chinese discourse, official discourse on Hamas and Israel has been very disturbing, including to Chinese people. So they're trying to show that let's be a leader. Let's show that we can discuss with the United States and go from there and try to improve the situation, since there are so many tensions around the world.
Jean-Paul Chang?
Yeah, I believe it's actually there never been an anti-American or hostile narrative against the United States. Let's say, of course, they are protesting loudly about the intervention of the United States in the Taiwan problems in the South China Sea, but officially, and China want to keep this profile of we are not hostile, we are not the people who took initiative to punish you, to raise the tariffs, etc.
Because it was interesting. What Andre was mentioning, when Andre was harking back earlier to the Cold War era, there was no trade between the Soviet Union and the United States. Whereas it's not in China's interest to be anti-American if they're
actually they are not.
If it's the U.S.'s number one import market.
Actually, they are not anti-American. They have a lot of admiration for the American system. They learn a lot. They copy the financial system. All kinds of financial products have been created in China following the American models, etc. And they are. But of course, now you have at the head of the state, you have people who have another consciousness of the risk for the country. Somehow they feel that maybe there's a danger for the nation because of the American behavior and the American policies for some years. And that's why, but they didn't change actually the narrative. So I'm not surprised by at any occasion, especially just before this meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping, they've been inviting people like Kissinger, the Flying Tigers heroes, etc., just to remind that people are friends. American people and Chinese, and there's nothing actually culturally, no traditional hate between two countries. Okay.
Of course, at the same time, the coverage of the United States in Chinese media, it's often plays up what also doesn't work in the U.S. I know this APEC summit's hosted in San Francisco, a city that's never quite recovered from the COVID pandemic, as emphasized here in this headline by the Rupert Murdoch-owned New York Post, which puts the accent on the homeless that have been chased from the center of the city. And Zongyang Liu, I guess we can expect some of that kind of coverage from Chinese media.
Yes, and this actually goes to show that how serious not just China, but also the United States and California or the city of San Francisco, the tremendous amount of political will to ensure that this meeting, or at least creating the environment to facilitate a success APEC, but more importantly, success US-China Leadership Summit. So from that perspective, I think that there are also challenges. People raise questions with regard to homelessness issue and drug abuse in San Francisco has been a huge problem, and the local government has never been able to clean it up until Chinese President Xi Jinping come to visit. So you generated this kind of different sentiment, if you will. But if I can take a step back by saying that China's leverage or America's weakness for this particular summit not only comes from China or the United States per se, but also in terms of a general economic environment in the region, specifically because of the Federal Reserve's rate hike, interest rate hikes. And you started to hear other ASEAN members, such as Malaysian Prime Minister as well as Finance Minister, started to revitalize this idea of Asian Monetary Fund. The idea is to reduce the region's dependence on the US dollar. So, in a way, there are a lot of undercurrent going on here. Although US-China relations is important, but I think there are a lot of other, interests going on here as well.
Andre Luzic-Pietri?
Yeah, the drug topic is interesting because that is one of the hopes of the American side to find an accord, because what's going on currently in the US, and actually it's happening also in Europe, that you have an invasion of these chemically synthetic drugs like fentanyl in the US or Captagon here in Europe. And some rumors, nobody can really prove it, that it's actually something which is actively promoted in order to undermine the essence of our societies. I mean, the narcos have found a much safer way or a cheaper way to remain in the drug business without having to cultivate the plants somewhere in Colombia and so on. And I think we have a lot. I mean, we have a conflict going on under our eyes, which is now in many other areas than in a pure military realm. So I think everybody has his tools and tries to have an impact on the other. And I think the U.S. currently is really faced with this drug epidemic, which some
what
say
you're saying is on the campaign trail, they'll be blaming on the Chinese, is what you're saying.
Well, a lot of people trace back a lot of these chemical drugs and some what they call these precursors of these drugs to factories back in China. So is it a strategy? Is it a business as anybody else would see another business? We don't know. But what is sure is that is a current huge societal issue and a national security issue from a U.S. point of view.
It could get ugly next year, Philippe Lecor, in the run-up to a close U.S. presidential election.
Yes, I agree. I mean, obviously, China has been a prime topic for U.S. presidential elections for many, many years. In fact, back in the 90s, I remember Bill Clinton and George Bush debating on China, and in the end, China got away with it. But this time, of course, if we're going to face Trump and Biden again, Donald Trump's foreign policy is always a bit of a mystery. We don't know what we're going to come up with, and certainly, but the China element might be. He might try to strike a deal with China, or he might strike to double down on the trade sanctions. Because remember that he started the war with China, the trade war, not a military war. But that sort of launched a kind of defensive policy from a number of countries, including in Europe, including in Australia. And these days, both parties on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, agreed that China is the adversary. That's what the Pentagon report on China is saying, that just came out a couple of weeks ago in Washington. So it's very difficult to find, positive voices on China. They're usually not in Washington. They're usually in other cities, like in Boston, where I spent part of my working life. Because people tend to be more reasonable and want to engage with China. At the same time, I mean, the business community is much less enthusiastic than it was vis-a-vis China. And so if you don't have the politicians, if you don't have the China watching community, and if you don't have the business community, it's going to be very hard for China to re-engage as well, because on the US side.
That brings us back to something Jean-Paul Chang was saying earlier, is that everybody's trying to figure out what's going on inside of the high halls of power. Last month in Beijing, there was a cabinet reshuffle that turned heads. Defense Minister Li Xiangfu and the former foreign minister, King Gang, sent packing. Li, who had disappeared from the public eye since the middle of August. Jean-Paul, are we any closer to figuring out why they were, I don't know, sent home, purged? I don't know what the right word is to use for these are two big names inside of the cabinet.
Yeah, that's true.
Do we know what happened?
Yeah, I mean, one is on the personal life side. Let's say the party considers that the lifestyle is a risk, is threatening national security when you are foreign minister, and you cannot have a private life with a child born in the United States secretly, etc., etc. So that's on one side. The thing is, of course, that has consequence on the functioning of the ministry after that. Okay, and because
we've been told that all the big purges happened at the party congress in 2022. And now there's a feeling, is this a second purge?
There's no big purge, let's say.
It's an ongoing.
But
sorry, and for the defense minister,
the defense minister, definitely it is a purge, because the inquiry back to 6 years of his position as the chief of the logistic department for the army, okay? And it's linked, that's what people are saying, to corruption problems, because logistic departments means arm procurement, money, etc. Okay, and not only him, Mr. Li.
Yeah, but there must have been some kind of trigger, because why did this happen suddenly? In the month he goes off to
because I believe again, I say that Xi Jinping has a personal belief from the beginning, even before he took his first term. In preparation of his first term, he'd been repeating about the lack of consciousness of risk among the party leadership and party members, because he feels that his country is at risk because of the uncertainty in the Sino-American relations, among other things. Okay, and that's why he has this kind of a belief. And when you feel,
is it paranoia?
I don't know, but okay, you can qualify that as you want. But anyway, I believe that this belief in that the country is somehow in a kind of existential risk, drives him to take measure of discipline. He wants no opposition. He wants to count on people behind him or below him, etc. And that's a continuation of his anti-corruption campaign since.
Since he came to power more than a decade ago. So Yang Nu, were you surprised by this reshuffle?
Honestly, I was a little bit surprised in the sense that exactly as you pointed out, after the 20th Party Congress, many analysts, including myself, thought this is the end of consolidation of power, and he installed himself as a third term, and perhaps for as long he can hold on to power for as long as he wanted. But then at the same time, when I reevaluated the situation, I realized I should not be surprised in the sense that on the one hand, holding on to power is like holding on to trying to hold a full hand of sand. The tighter you grab it, the more difficult trying to hold on to it, because you are going to encounter challenges from your underlings. And it also becomes a challenge to distribute power, because as soon as you try to distribute power, you run the risk of empowering different groups, and they might gather their own momentum and create their own underlings that may eventually challenge your hold on to power. But then, on the other hand, I feel like we cannot completely rule out the fact that President Xi Jinping realized the cost to the Chinese economy because of because of U.S. export controls, investment screening has become so high. Therefore, he is facing a very tight budget constraint in terms of channeling to limited financial resources to support the strategic sectors that he really wanted to develop, like quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and a semiconductor. And therefore, he needs to think about how to basically scrape off or squeeze out the grease in the system. And where you get started, I think China would not be the first country to say, or the only country to say, well, in the defense sector, there is always going to be a lot of grease there.
China, Philippe Lecor, is a country that likes stability. Let me ask you, since COVID, we have seen the world become a more dangerous place. We've been covering the war in Ukraine closely on this show. Since October the 7th, our eyes have been squarely on the eruption in the Middle East. When you think about what's going on just domestically inside of his cabinet, does that make the world a more dangerous place, what's happening inside of China?
Well, it certainly doesn't make people more confident in China as a how should I call it, a peaceful superpower. When you look at the military budget, which is, I believe, over $200 billion a year and counting, and the fact that China, is using,
which is peanuts, by the way, compared to the United States.
Yeah, but it's been growing for the past 40 years constantly, and one wonders. I mean, you were talking about paranoia. One wonders what's the game being played there, and at the same time supporting diplomatically people like Vladimir Putin, just because it's part of his calculation of withdrawing of the international order. So I mean, I'm optimistic about this meeting because it's happening, right? The fact they are meeting in San Francisco is positive. Now, I don't think China's discourse or policy will change just because of that meeting, and I don't think we'll wake up on Thursday with a very different words. But at least, communications in the military is important because there are many risks in Indo-Pacific, in the South China Sea particularly. Ask the government of the Philippines particularly, and especially ahead of a presidential election in Taiwan, with the high possibility of a DPP candidate, a autonomy candidate to being elected to succeed President Tsai. So all these are risks because China is not in a very good economic state, and the society of China is also not at its best, to say the least. So that sort of brings risks in terms of nationalistic discourse, and the fact the military is being purged the way it has been recently is also a sign that the military is on top of everything, really. And the People's Liberation Army, it belongs to the CCP, and that will continue forever.
André de Zuckerpietri, upcoming elections in Taiwan. We've had almost daily standoffs between the Philippines Coast Guard and China in the South China Sea. A meeting on Wednesday, it's nice, it helps?
Well, it helps because there is a hope among probably a lot of people that China may come back to a more pragmatic stance. I mean, they're realizing, as was mentioned before, that actually economically they definitely need still the input of the US, be it of the market or be it of the technology. They hope they will delay the sanction on technology, the export control, which the Europeans are just starting to begin to scrutinize, have hurt China much more than the import restriction or the investment restriction in the US, because suddenly a lot of the US companies have now restrictions to invest more in China. And then look at the history. The history is full of, number one, decisions that were made that are not rational. And I think today Unfortunately, China is more a wild card than a stability component. I mean, when Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine almost 2 years, 1.5 years ago, it was definitely not rational for Russia, but he still did it. And the second thing is, as you mentioned, the number of issues with the neighboring countries is so important that one of these small glitches can turn, we don't want that, of course, into a full-scale conflict. And so I think the US, both the US and China are currently preparing for the worst, and I think that is very pragmatic in order, hopefully, to restore some kind of normality. So I'm also hopeful, but now let's see if facts follow. There's nice meetings. Night meetings are not enough anymore.
All right. And we'll be watching that Wednesday meeting on France 24. I want to thank you, André Lezeguc-Perche, Jean-Paul Cheng. I want to thank Philippe Lecor for being with us from Rennes in Western France and Zhonglan Liu in Washington. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.